Welcome to Pete's Property Podcast, brought to you by Buyers and hosted by Pete Wargent, buyer's agent, finance and real estate expert, and all-round property guru, plus published author. Join Pete for 30 minutes as he chats all things property with a new guest each week. Learn practical tips from the movers and shakers in the property industry and well-known personalities sharing their property journeys.
G'day, welcome to Pete's Property Podcast. This week I've got an extra special guest, Mr. Bushy Martin. So Bushy, first and foremost, tell us, how did you even get the name Bushy? Is it as simple as it sounds, or is there a different story behind that?
Well, there's a lot of different stories behind it, Pete, but the simple version is that I'm a boy from the bush, country boy at heart, always have been. So Bushy's the obvious nickname, but it's actually the living legacy of my good father. Bushy, my father was the original Bushy, Bush Senior, and he was a legend of a man. You can't pick your friends. What do they say, Pete? That can't pick your family, but you can only pick your friends. I got very lucky with my family. My old man was an absolute living legend. He was the original Bushy, and he had a massive reputation and has left us a big legacy. So out of respect for Dad, I really, I've always used to be Bushy Junior, but I've sort of reverted back to Bushy, and every time you call me Bushy, Pete, I think of Dad. So that's the short version.
So you've graduated to the title of Bushy. What is your actual real name?
Mate, it's as boring as John Martin, mate, is the real name. And there's more John Martins than there are Bill Smiths, Pete. So Bushy is a much better standout, and it says a lot more about me anyway, mate. I'm fairly down to earth. I call it how it is. I'm sort of not too tangled up with the PC rubbish, and just enjoy a good laugh and enjoy life, mate.
That's a very wise mantra. Funnily enough, I went to school with a guy called John Martin. I doubt he's tuning in, but if you are, g'day, John, and your namesake on the show today. So, and what did your old man do, and whereabouts did you grow up?
Yeah, so I'm as I say, a country boy. I was born and bred in Garoke, mate. Which when I say Garoke, most people say, isn't that somewhere in New Guinea? Well, no, it's not. It's actually in Western Victoria, and it's a tiny 2-horse town. I think they just about closed up when our family left, mate. That's how big the town is. But my old man was actually a stock and station agent. So with a group called Dowgetties for many years. So what that meant was we tended to move around the country all over the place. Every 2 or 3 years, we're off to a different country town. So I went from Garoke to Mooroopna to Shepparton to Echuca, and then across to South Australia. We spent some time at Lameroo and Bordertown and Port Noarlunga South and Wollonga and Aldinga Beach. So we've moved around the country a fair bit on the tails of Dad's work as a country stock and station agent. But his secret passion behind the scenes was always property, Pete. So it's sort of been in the blood.
Yeah, some fabulous Victorian towns there. I haven't been down to Victoria for a couple of years, but as you know, I do love travel. And as somebody who migrated to Australia, I was dead keen when I came to the country. I wanted to not just be stuck in Sydney like all the other Poms of Bondi. I wanted to see the whole country. And I've spent time in Echuca and Shepparton and a lot of those places, and a fabulous place to grow up. So you
Awesome.
mentioned there, oh yes, superb. And I think actually we've just seen in the last couple of years actually an increasing popularity. Places like Bendigo and Geelong and Ballarat really taking off. I think people are seeing another side to the regional towns now, as the cities have been a bit less popular through the pandemic. So you mentioned there you had some family input. So tell us a bit about your property journey and how you got into real estate.
Yeah, well, I guess it's funny how these things happen by osmosis, I reckon, a lot of the time, Pete. But I spent many a weekend as a kid sitting in the car driving around with Dad as he bought and sold blocks of land. And this was back in the 70s, I reckon, early 70s. And he managed to get on into a period there where you could buy a block of land, sign the contract, and make good money on it before you actually settled on it. So he was buying and selling all the time, and he put together quite a good little sum of money, put himself in a pretty good position in those days. I was a pretty sickly kid, Pete. I was, a punk-chested runt, to be perfectly honest, and spent a lot of time in bed with asthma, and therefore always had a pen in my hand. I was always drawing and creating and designing, and I just that was all I could do, given that I was bedridden. So, but my old man always used to say to me, "Son, that's all very nice, but sometime you've got to get yourself a real job." And the old head scratch, mate. And the only the sort of compromise that I could bring together with my creative side of the equation and a real job was to become an architect. So I toddled off to uni for 5 years and became an architect. And then again, with the gypsy blood, travelled all over Australia and a fair bit of Asia being an architect until my early to mid-30s.
That's interesting, actually, because I've often wondered why I keep moving. I must have moved house more than anybody I know over the past 20 years. We seem to be doing it all the time. But then I remember I actually went to 4 different schools growing up, and I wonder if it harks back to the old saying, "Give me the boy of 7 and I'll show you the man." And maybe a bit the same there. If you saw your dad buying and selling blocks of land, maybe that real estate idea was just born at an early age, and sounds like you followed through with it. So did you, you ended up actually running your own architect's business, didn't you?
Yeah, I did, mate. So I had a really interesting career as an architect, and I still love architecture. It's just a lousy business in Australia. So when I finished uni, there was in Adelaide at the time, which is where I finished uni, there was no work happening. The only thing being built in Adelaide at the time were tombstones, mate. There was very little happening. So I ended up working for free for a period just to get some experience. And then I managed to get a job with a crocodile skin farmer in New Guinea. And I call it my Indiana Jones days, mate. I spent a couple of years up there in New Guinea designing townhouses, and I also did a wilderness safari lodge way out in the northeast coast of New Guinea, a beautiful part of the world. So I spent some time up there. Then I gradually gravitated south. So I went from PNG to Darwin. I spent about 8 years in Alice Springs. Then went to Bangkok for a stretch and spent some time doing some tourism work over there. I then went over to Perth and did some work in Perth before actually coming back to Adelaide to spend some time with the folks, given they started to have some health conditions, mate. So I got to see a fair bit of the country as an architect, but I burnt myself out, Pete. Architecture is an all-consuming profession, and for someone who has perfectionist tendencies, it's a bad combination for someone like me. So I had what I call my sort of major burnout early life crisis at 33, and I sort of can divide my life into 2 halves, mate. The time before that I call BC, which is before the crisis, and after that is AD, which is after the divorce. So I pretty much had a ground zero moment when I was 33. Absolutely started again. And I was, not like most Aussies, mate. My vision of life at that stage was to work hard, get a good career, buy a home, pay it off, put money into super, and then tick off the bucket list when I retired. That model is it doesn't work quite clearly. So it was a big wake-up call for me when that all turned to poo, and I really did start again. So I sat down at that time, and a couple of years after that, I met my now wife and life partner, Sonia. And the first thing we did, Pete, we actually sat down at a little restaurant in Clarendon, which is a beautiful part of Adelaide in the hills. And with the old architecture skills, we designed our ideal life. And because I determined not to end up in the same place that I was. And we actually spent a lot of time visualizing it, documenting it. We monetized it. So we worked out what that lifestyle was going to cost. And then about the same time, it's funny how these things happen in 2s and 3s, but a mate of mine dragged me along to a Robert Kiyosaki conference in Adelaide, and the whole passive income penny dropped. It really was an eye-opening moment for me. And from that moment on, Pete, I became what I now affectionately refer to as passive-aggressive. So absolutely everything we did from that point had to have a passive income opportunity, and anything that we put our energy in had to be a growth asset that was scalable and saleable. So whether it be business, whether it be our equities investments, whether that be our property investments, they all had to tick those boxes. And at the same time, my wife and I adopted what I, again, retrospectively referred to as the money Madison. The bicycle race where there's two bikes going around the track, and one pair is up on the side of the track having a rest while the other one's going for broke, and then they change place every couple of laps. So you're always someone having a rest and someone driving. Well, what Sonia and I decided to do was that one would work full time, and we would live off that income, while the other party would do the investment. So our first entourage, because we had nothing, Sonia worked. I day traded the equities market. I was pretty aggressive in those days, mate. I did CFDs, so I wouldn't be suggesting anyone rush out and do CFDs now, because it's a very risky instrument. But that was enough to build up a deposit for our first property. And because of, I'd been doing a lot of reading, I read everything that opened and shut when it came to investment at that stage, because I was so keen to create an environment where my income didn't rely on me to generate it. So using the old money Madison, we started with day trading. We then got into property. We then started our own property management business, because we could see that was a pretty good way to build up a passive income stream, again, that was saleable. So Sonia drove that business while I went back and did some consulting to government at that stage. So I paid the bills while Sonia built the property management asset. Then once that was up and running, it became really clear to us that property is a game of finance. So I recognise just how important the finance is to the equation. So I then jumped back in and started a finance broking business, and we built that up. And all the way along that journey, of course, we were investing in properties as a major growth asset to put us in a position where we could then convert that into a tax-effective income stream and get our time back, which is ultimately what it was all about. So that's a bit of the background, I guess, mate.
Yes, and we'll come on to the idea of financing and, as they say, property being a game of finance with houses in the middle. It's interesting there. You mentioned the Robert Kiyosaki book. It's amazing how many people actually tell that story. They read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and then it kind of changed the way they thought about relying on their career and their job, and then thinking about ways to build that passive income stream. So there's a recommendation for you if you haven't read it. It's only a short book. I think it was sometime maybe in the mid-90s that it came out. So if anyone hasn't read it, check out a copy. I'm sure you can pick them up almost for free these days. And some familiar themes there. I think you don't speak to many people these days who go through life with just one de facto relationship. And I think a lot of people have a tendency to beat themselves up about these things. But I speak at an annual event at the Gold Coast called the Wealth Retreat. And one of the exercises they do there each year is to almost draw a graph of your life. And when you see even some hugely successful people, you see that it's never a straight line. Success comes and goes, and you have setbacks and health issues, and you lose people along the way. And it's very, very common to see people have a dip at some point along the journey. But the most important thing, of course, is how you respond to the crises. So I guess... sorry, you go, Bushy.
Yeah, I'd go as far as saying, Pete, that while I call it the sort of car crash, it's the best thing that happened to me, Pete. Because if I wasn't forced to stop and prop and have a really good think about what I was doing, I probably would have just continued on. So, if I look back on it now, if it wasn't for that, there's no way I'd currently be in the position that I'm in.
Yeah, of course. And I think often you hear people say this, the rock bottom is when things start to improve. And we'll come on to the question that I really want to discuss today, and that is whether Aussies can self-fund their retirement through a property pension. But I guess before we just come on to that, just give us a couple of insights into what have been your biggest mistakes in property, and on the other side of the coin, what have been the best property decisions you've ever made?
Yeah, well, if we talk about the mistake side, I reckon I've made every mistake known to man when it comes to property, because like a lot of people, I tried to reinvent the wheel when I started because I didn't trust anyone. And that was a big mistake, mate. So, I could talk ad nauseum about that. In relation to the learnings, though, I think the biggest learnings, when I sat down to write my book, The Freedom Formula, it forced me to have a really good look at what I'd done and what had worked and what hadn't worked. And I'm a fairly conservative investor, Pete. I take calculated risks, but I'm fairly conservative in it. And so the approach that I sort of, I like to give everything a title. It's really a wealth by stealth approach is what I'm talking about. So my own belief, and everyone's got their own beliefs, and there's no one size fits all in property, is that, sustainable success takes a minimum of 15 years. And that doesn't apply just to property either. That's almost anything you invest in, whether it be business or you name it. So the key to last that distance is to embrace what I call TLC, which is embrace time as your friend, not your enemy. So accept that it's going to take at least 15 years and then enjoy the journey. Leverage of other people and other people's money, because you can make your money go a lot further, and property is the best vehicle in Australia to do that. And then, of course, the last that in the TLC is compounding. So, embrace the impact of compounding, not just in the value of your assets, but your relationships, and the more energy you put into it, they compound on each other and things just grow. But it's an exponential curve. So you don't see any or very little change early on, then most of the growth tends to occur in the latter part of the journey. So that was some of the key learnings there. The other, and I like to document this, but if I break down the 8 key principles that I think any investor needs to adopt if they're going to be successful, and if you shortcut any of them, then you'll get yourself into strife. But I like to refer to them as the preventative wealth vitamins. So if we break vitamins down into each letter as a component, the V is for value. So you've got to achieve the highest value of asset that you can get your hands on. So that's about equity, and that's about borrowing capacity. So, the bigger asset base you can get as quickly as you can, the better result you're going to get over time. The second one is I, which is interest rate growth. So that's the compounding component. So you've got to focus on the highest growth location for that particular asset and make sure it's affordable. Time is the next ingredient. So again, as I say, if you're trying to do it in 5 or 10 years, I think you're kidding yourself. You might get lucky, but it's at least a 15-year journey. And then they are the setup elements. And then the last 5 of the vitamins are what I call the sustainability elements. So they are A, for affordability. And affordability is something that I don't see a lot of investors put much energy into, Pete. They go and buy the property and they don't really break down exactly how much per week is this property going to take out or put in my pocket. So that affordability piece, if you're going to last 15 to 20 years to get a result, you need to be structuring things really well so that it's at least cash flow neutral, if not slightly cash flow positive, and then there's no pressure. Mindset is the M. So that's how you think, your self-beliefs, your expectations, your attitudes. The I in vitamins is income. And this is, I see a lot of would-be investors thinking that they're going to become full-time property developers, and they jump ship, give away their job, and then they can't borrow money, so they're snookered. So having an ongoing income stream is important to fund the growth of your portfolio. The N is for network. So, I think property is an elite team sport, and you need to be the dumbest person in the room, and you don't want to be a doer. You just need to be the manager of your team. So you own the team, you just manage your managers. That's the key part there. And then the final part, and the most important component, is the strategy piece. So that's getting really clear about where you're heading, where you're trying to get to, and therefore what sort of property approach needs to be adopted to get you there. So they're the key bits. And if I sort of sum that up, mate, in terms of the strategy that we adopt, I go for growth and then convert to cash flow. And in my book, I've actually documented the capital growth to cash flow curve. So very simply, I always hear this argument around, growth versus cash flow. It's really simple for me, mate. If your current asset base isn't at the level that it needs to be to throw off the income that's going to fund your lifestyle, you're in the growth phase. So your major focus needs to be on affordable growth. When you get to a point when your income producing asset base is at or near the level where it needs to be, then you convert that portfolio into a tax-effective income stream. So I guess one of the differences I have around the buy and holders, and I am sort of, for most parts, a buy and holder in terms of go for growth initially, but the philosophy of buying property, paying off the debt, and then living off the rent's never going to be enough to actually give you the lifestyle you need. But the key, what property is good for is a growth vehicle. So for me, it's focus on high growth properties initially. And once that asset growth has got to the required level, then convert that into a mix of higher yielding properties, indexes in the equities front, a mix of cash, bonds, so that we're diversifying the exercise at that end and keeping some high yielding properties as a part of that mix. So they're probably the key learnings along the way.
Do you want to save on buyer's agent fees? You could save thousands with Buyers Buyers. As Australia's most extensive network of buyer's agents, we can lock in highly competitive prices. Plus, our national network of buyer's agents are some of the best in the business. So get the Buyers Buyers advantage and talk to us today. Call 1-800-975-051 or visit buyersbuyers.com.au.
So another book recommendation for you there, The Freedom Formula by our guest this week, Bushy Martin. I especially enjoyed the foreword or the quote on the front cover.
Yeah, they had your name on it. Yeah, it's a cracker, mate. Thanks for doing that.
No, it's a top book, actually. You can see the time and effort that you've put into it. And as you mentioned, a bit of a perfectionist you are too. Interesting point you made there on the on building wealth over a 15-year period. I think that generally holds true. I've observed a lot over the years. And I think it's true that sometimes people can have a real bagatelle win, almost like a windfall, but often that seems to be sort of an easy come, easy go situation. I think for people building sustainable lifetime wealth and equity through property, it often does seem to take 2 full cycles or 15 years. So you make an investment or two, draw some equity, and then reinvest some of the equity elsewhere. And then it's usually after that second cycle that suddenly people wake up and they've got a big pool of equity. And I
think the other point that's in parallel with that is that it's not all about the asset investment in the assets, investment in your knowledge, and over those 2 cycles, your own maturity and your own knowledge of how it all works and how the jigsaw fits together is so much better, so that you're better placed to make better decisions as you go forward. So I think people tend to focus on the external, but getting the headset right, getting the mindset and your knowledge and your approach right, so that your expectations are there, is a big contributor to the ultimate long-term success, mate.
Yeah, and as you know, a lot can change over 15 years in your personal life and in terms of your maturity, because we often do 10-year property plans, but even just doing this sort of scenario of thinking, well, what was I doing on this day 10 years ago? And you think, life is actually pretty different. So, your maturity and knowledge levels can change a phenomenal amount over 15 years. So let's come on to this key question then. I had an interview. Actually, no, not an interview. I actually caught up for a coffee with one of Australia's most senior business journalists, and he was quite skeptical about the idea of whether everyday Aussies can actually self-fund their retirement through a property pension. But you and I both know many people who've done this, and not just by a small margin, they've managed it very successfully. So what do you think about everyday Aussies going down that route? And if so, what kind of strategies would you recommend?
Yeah, so the easy answer to that is it possible? Absolutely it is. I've done it, you've done it, and we've helped an enormous number of people do exactly the same thing. And you've got to consider the alternative, Pete, because the traditional model in Australia is to pay off your mortgage, put money into super, and then there's a wish and a hope that that's going to be enough to fund and maintain and sustain your lifestyle once you decide to stop work. Well, if you look at the stats, and you know the stats better than I, it was over, I think it's nearly 74% of retirees over the age of 65 who have adopted that model, surviving on an average of just over $15,000 a year, mate. And the big paradox here is that unless you've got more, and I heard a chat by Alan Kohler recently where he'd done some analysis, and if you've got any less than $800,000 worth in super, you might as well have none, because up to $800,000, for every increase in asset, it's dropping what you can get back in the pension. And the pension for a couple is about 35 odd grand at the moment. So there's a big wake-up call there for a lot of Aussies. If you think that's the model that's going to get you there, you really need to sit down and do some hard thinking about that now, because I know, because I get to talk to people every day of the week on this, and I actually start off by projecting, if you do nothing differently in what you're doing, where you're going to end up. And 90% of those people, they're on good incomes, they've got their home and they've got a home loan. If they don't do anything differently, will end up surviving on somewhere between 15 and 25 grand a year if they decide to pull the pin, or they'll work until the day they drop. So can it be done in property? Absolutely, it can be. And I like to refer to what we've now developed as the freedom numbers, Pete. So, and the most important part there is spending the time to look at what is your ideal lifestyle income, because it's going to be different for everyone. Some people can live off the smell of an oily rag. Other people have very expensive tastes. But if you get clear on what your lifestyle income looks like, and let's say it's 100 grand. So, and let's say you've got 20 years to put this together, then at a 5% net return, you need about $2 million worth of income producing assets to make that happen. Now, $2 million over a 20-year timeline is only 2 or 3 properties based on fairly conservative growth rates. So can it be done? Absolutely. How can it be done? Really simple. If you're still working, you've got some equity in the home, it's just a matter of progressively over a sort of a 5-year period, using the combination of equity and borrowing capacity to secure 2 or 3 good quality, high growth properties. And that's about taking a borderless approach, as you mentioned earlier, rather than buying a property that you'd live in your backyard, which most people tend to do. So it's adopting a really national borderless approach to this. And then most importantly, it's spending time with a good accountant to make sure that and a really good finance broker to make sure that you're structuring things in such a way that it's maximizing your capacity while minimizing your risk. Because, I often say to people on the finance side of the equation, your biggest asset isn't the rate, because most people will chase rate when it comes to finance. Your biggest asset that you need to preserve as an investor is your borrowing capacity. And there's about nearly a 60% borrowing capacity variation across all the lenders. So that's the difference between say a $600,000 property and $1 million property based on exactly the same profile, just using a bank that has a bigger appetite. So if you focus on getting that structure right, you maximize your capacity, you do 2 or 3 good quality growth properties, which most people on an average income can afford to do in this day and age, Pete, then funding that $100,000 to $200,000 a year lifestyle over that 20-year period is very achievable.
Yeah, so some interesting points there. I had lunch with Grant Williams, who is the founder of Real Vision, this week. Just a bit of name dropping there, but he asked me sort of off the cuff, how did I actually get involved in property in the first place? And on reflection, I thought, well, basically what happened was my wife bought her first place. We sort of hooked up, got together. I'd bought my first place in Bondi. It wasn't really big enough for the both of us. We bought a place together. So we sort of had 3 properties. And then we thought, well, this seems to have worked well. And then from there, we decided to sort of start investing in a portfolio of properties. But you mentioned there that some of the things have changed. Now, people often say to me, well, yeah, look, it's all right for you guys because, you started, in the 1990s and things were a lot easier then. But is it harder today than 20 years ago, or is it just different? You did mention one thing that's definitely different, and that's the financing. Because, yeah. There are things like 100% mortgages or even more in the UK for a period of time. But also, if you had equity, in those days, you could just go again and again. These days, obviously, borrowing capacity is capped for most people. Some would say rightly. So is it harder now for people to self-fund retirement through property?
I would say no, but that's easy for me to say. And the reason I say no is that, yes, you're right in the context that the lending constraints are much tougher than what they used to be. And when I started out in the late 90s, Pete, with our first property, I think I borrowed 97% plus mortgage insurance to get a property. You can't do that now. And on an investment front, most banks cap out at 90%. You can still get some that'll get up to 95%. So it's still a fair chunk of the exercise. But the cost of the money is a lot cheaper now than it was then too, by the way. So there's sort of swings and roundabouts in all of that. The key, I think, is to get really crystal clear again on what you are personally trying to achieve, and make sure you've got a long enough timeline. If you're trying to shoehorn something into a 5 to 10 year period, and we've all seen them, mate, the people who do nothing with their head in the sand, they go for broke on their career and they get into their early 50s and they have their, oh shit, super moment. Oh shit, my super's not going to be enough to fund my retirement. And then they expect people like you and I to pull a rabbit out of the hat and have them retired comfortably at 60. Well, that ain't going to happen, I don't believe. But if you've got a long enough timeline, so again, minimum 15 years, then for most people on an average income with decent equity, 2 or 3 properties will get you there, providing you're structuring it right and you're focusing on maximum growth. Now, I hear this affordability thing. It's all right for you old blokes, Bushy, but young guys like me who are still living at home. Well, when I had my car crash crisis, Pete, we rent vested initially, and that was rent vesting before rent vesting was even a thing. We just worked out that I had a good chat to an accountant and I did the numbers and it's like, we'd be crazy buying this place to live in. We'd be better off doing investing and then renting cheaply near the city where we were working at the time in Adelaide. And so I'm a big fan of rent vesting, both at the beginning of the journey and at the end of the journey too, by the way. If you're nomadic at the end of the journey, then why would you tie yourself down to an asset that is worth money on paper, but it's not giving you an income? I think it has merits at both ends of that journey. So is it more difficult now? No, I think you've got to be smarter on how you do it, but we've got more access to information than we've ever had. There's more data than we've ever had. There's more experts and professionals than we've ever had. So I would say it's just different. You've just got to be smarter and clever about how you make that happen.
Yeah, I think you must have read my mind there on the rent vesting point, because I am somebody who is seemingly increasingly nomadic. I'm somewhat obsessed with travel, want to see all the places in the world. And actually, when you are renting or rent vesting, you can live anywhere, and often it works out better from a financial point of view. Now, I guess when I've been traveling around over the past year in particular, I've spent some time in Europe and more recently Sydney and now Gold Coast. And I've become, I meet a lot of people interested in finance and investing, property, retirement. And one of the questions I've been asking people a lot recently, and I apologize if you're one of them, is, what's the end game? I'm really fascinated to know, where do people plan to end up? What are they going to do in retirement? Now, I guess, it's still relatively early for me, and unless my super is still 20 years away, but I'm really interested to hear what people plan to do in retirement. I know you're interested in travel too, Bushy, having recently come back from Fiji. But I guess, how does one go about designing a retirement? Because I know this is something that you do very differently from a lot of the finance and property professionals out there, and you'd like to try and begin with the end in mind. But where do you even start with that?
Yeah, it's I devote a whole chapter of the book to that very topic, mate, because I've actually broken down the steps that Sonia and I went through, plus a whole bunch of other stuff. But the starting point is the end point, as you've said, mate. So we've just come back from Fiji, and 4 days of that trip was spent with our life planning review. We do it every year. We look at what's changed. Are we still on track? What needs to change? But we've got a really crystal clear view on what life looks like. So, we're getting to the what I would call the significant stage of our journey, not the success stage. So this year we're going to do a road trip up the East Coast from Tasmania up the East Coast to find a forever destination for us. And we've put some really clear shape around what a perfect day, a perfect week, and the perfect year looks like. We know how much that costs and incorporates a fair bit of travel. Because like you, Pete, I get a real buzz out of seeing new places and meeting new people and immersing myself in new culture. So we're going to be doing a lot more of that. The reason I got into podcasting is that I can do podcasting from anywhere at any time, and it gives me a great excuse to talk to some fantastic people like yourself. So I'll keep doing that until the day I drop. But we've got a real crystal clear view on what that lifestyle is, what that lifestyle costs, and therefore all we've done is utilize as little of our own money to acquire as big an asset base as possible, as quickly as possible, and make it as affordable as possible. We've let time, the tenants, and the taxman do most of the heavy lifting. And as we come into that journey where we're changing from growth to cash flow, then we're starting to, and I've already started to rationalise our asset base. So we offloaded some of our property last year because it's a real blue patch, so that we can convert that asset base into higher yielding exercises. And one of the key things for me as an investor, which I haven't mentioned, is that whatever I invest in, I want to spend as little time as I possibly have to manage that asset, because time is my most important ingredient. So as we start to convert our growth portfolio and transition across into a tax-effective income stream, which we'll do over a sort of 5 or 6 year period so that we don't get caught with capital gains and a whole bunch of other stuff, then we can convert that portfolio into a means that's actually going to give us the ideal lifestyle that we've got a really clear picture. We're living on a hill and a rural property looking down the valley to water. We take our dogs for a walk every day. I'm exercising, I'm playing piano, I'm podcasting, I'm writing the next book. So I've got a really clear picture on exactly how I want to live. And everything that we've been doing over this last 20 years has been orientated around making that happen, Pete. So it's not rocket science. As I say, for anyone listening to this, I have devoted a whole chapter to it, and actually as a complimentary value add to your podcast, Pete. For anyone who either emails you or emails me at bushy@knowhowproperty.com.au, I'll give you for free a PDF excerpt of that chapter, because it'll give you some real direction on how you need to start that whole process. Because it is, for a lot of people, it's like, well, where do I start? And it gets too hard so that I don't do it. But it's a really fun exercise, Pete. We have a lot of fun doing this. And once you do crystallize it, it becomes both a magnet to make sure you can negotiate the inevitable speed humps that occur along the investment journey. But it's also a compass in that every decision that we make day to day has been around, is it taking us closer to that lifestyle or further away from it? And it's more like a GPS. As you said before, there's dynamics of lifestyle and economies and everything else. So it's not a fixed roadmap. It's a GPS. That means that we might tack slightly differently as we're going down that pathway, but we because we're clear on where we want to end up, we're always going to tack and correct back on track to accommodate all that.
Yeah, a couple of really interesting points you mentioned there. On the point of investing in assets for the end game that require little maintenance, because as you said, time maintenance, property can be a bit of a headache at times. You mentioned indexes and ETFs, much less so, as long as you're not sitting there watching them day to day. And
Exactly.
Aussie friend of mine, James Aiken, who currently lives in Wimbledon in London, I remember him saying to me, the assets can end up owning you rather than the other way around. So that is one really interesting point you mentioned.
Yeah, I've always said, don't create a job when you invest. If you have, you defeated the purpose. So the key for me, and what I've been investing now, is getting really good people around you, and then just all you have to do is manage them. So if my investments are taking any more than an hour a month, and then maybe a day around tax time, I've done the wrong thing, Pete.
Yeah, it's a very good point, especially for the retirement years. And I think the other interesting thing you mentioned there was on the podcasting idea, because Grant Williams, who I mentioned, I mean, he largely does just podcasting these days, long form podcasting. But it's a great point because these days there are many ways to create an income with your interests. And we've particularly seen this through the pandemic with people working from home or remotely. There's lots of ways to do things that you're interested in and also potentially create an income with them. So you've now got me thinking about what my perfect day is. I think a run on the beach and a swim, but then probably 6 cups of coffee and arguing with people on social media. So I think I probably need some work on the designing the perfect day. So we mentioned your book before there, Bushy, The Freedom Formula. We'll include the PDF for you in the link below the podcast as well. So definitely recommend getting a copy of that. And if people want to know a little bit more about what you do and know how, where should they go for more?
Yeah, there's two ways to do that. There's my own personal website, bushymartin.com.au, which has got the podcast, the book, and the details. If you want to know a bit about how we can help you to go on a similar journey to what we've done with the property focus in particular, then knowhowproperty.com.au. We're a people-based business, mate, so we like to talk to people. So pick up the phone and have a chat to us. It's much better than the remote world. So you can ring us on 08 8383 6990. We're a boutique team, but we're on a mission to help as many like-minded, hardworking Aussies to live their ideal lifestyle using property as a big part of that vehicle. So we'd love to have a chat.
Fantastic. And we should just say thanks because over the years, John, or Bushy, I should say, you've helped so many Aussies on their journey with great generosity with your time and insight. So thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Cheers.
Would love to, mate. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks for listening to Pete's Property Podcast, powered by Buyers. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time as Pete chats all things property with a new guest. And just a reminder that the information provided in this podcast is general advice only and doesn't take into account your personal financial situation or needs. You should always consult a licensed professional to discuss your individual personal circumstances.